Hi, everyone. Welcome to the week 4 of the Ubuntu Symposium. We're going to get started now very shortly. Before we do, I'm just going to run through just a few housekeeping rules. So welcome to today's session, which is going to be on understanding the global tide of patriarchal backlash. There's going to be a live interpretation available in French and Spanish. So please, using the globe icon at the bottom of your screen, please select the language that you'd like to listen in. We also have live subtitles available in 18 languages on Wordly. So if you want to access this, you just click on the top left corner of the screen. That's where it says live on custom live streaming service. Then click view stream on custom live streaming service. And then it will open a Wordly browser. A Wordly window in your browser, which you can then resize so you can look at it at the same time as you're watching the session. And these are the languages that it's available in. Okay, so I'm going to pass you over to Jirker to start the session now in 1 second. Jirker.
Yes, hello. I'm welcome, first of all, to this session on understanding the global tide of patriarchal backlash. Which is the first session in a series that's being co-organized between MenEngage and some of us at the program that I'll just tell you about. So I'm Jirker Edstrom, a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and I'm a program convener for a 5-year research and action program called Countering Backlash with partners in 9 countries, some of whom are at this session, and it's supported by Swedish SIDA. So I'll be chairing and introducing the session to you, first of all, and focus on a few questions like why are we here today, what we'll be hearing about, and what will we be discussing, who will you hear from, how will the session and method run for this session, what else do we need to think about, and then what then in terms of following the session. So why are we here? First of all, the thing to note, I think, is that the world has changed. Many of us realized it. Anti-gender backlash seems to be all around us, from the US, Brazil, to Europe, to Turkey, Uganda, Russia, or India, you name it, almost. Those are some of the most obvious places, of course. But when did the world change and how? It seems to have been brewing for many years. Although it wasn't always obvious, and it's only recently become more widespread as a revelation, more or less, that backlash is more generalized. But at the same time, our theories and frameworks for doing gender in development as well as in movement seems to feel increasingly out of date, possibly out of touch. So what will the discussions focus on in this session? We have 3 pairs of discussions. Conversations, we call them. And the first one will be focusing on, well, it's coming from India. We'll hear from Sana Contractor, who is a researcher working with, who has done some work with Center for Health and Social Justice, CSSJ in India recently, on backlash, a literature review. And we will hear from Europe. Eva Zilén from Sweden, the organization Kvinna till Kvinna, which is networked with organizations throughout Europe, but also in the Middle East and the broader MENA region, I believe. They will tell you more about issues around anti-gender backlash in India and in Europe, some of which touch on issues such as ethnonationalism, for example, but also other issues. The second conversation is about colonizing racial masculinities, if you like, south to north. And we will hear from David Simba, who is a senior researcher with the Refugee Law Project in Uganda, who will be conversing with Alan Gregg from the United States, who is co-founder of the Challenging Male Supremacy Project, as well as a researcher and an advisor who does some work with us in this Countering Backlash program as well. Now, that conversation will probably involve race and colonization in a more direct way, but we will see. I don't want to preempt the conversations too much. Then we'll have a short break, followed by a third conversation between two very well-known people in this field. First of all, Denise Candioti, who's emeritus professor at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, UK. Conversing with Sonia Correa, who is a senior research associate at a Brazilian organization for HIV and AIDS. And I cannot, each of you can introduce yourself better during your talks if you want. As well as Sonia is also a co-chair, of course, of Sexuality Policy Watch. Now, they will be taking a slightly longer term perspective view for a bigger picture, looking at questions such as tracing the local to the global, looking at the role of regional gender machineries and pushback to that, and the role of neoliberal dynamics within all of that. Sonia will be touching more on tracing the development of anti-gender ideologies linked to organized religions, but also with links to secular neoliberal connections and so on. Again, I don't want to preempt the discussions, so I will not go into the content more, but how will we do this? Just to provide a general methodology, we'll be having each pair of two conservationists, or conversationalists, I should say. They will present two short consecutive 5-minute provocations or presentations, one following the other. Then the two of them will engage in 7 to 10 minutes of conversation between them, reflecting on each other's presentation provocation. That is then followed by 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Now, our colleague and friend Chloe Skinner will be monitoring those, and I will call on her to call those questions. Note that this is a short time. Each block of conversations will be about 25 minutes each. So not all questions will be answered, but don't worry, there will be more time in the plenary discussion at the end of the 3 conversations. So each block of conversations is 2 conversations. So over the next 50 minutes or so, we'll have the first 2 blocks of conversations. And then we have a midway break of about 20 minutes, followed by the 3rd conversation for another 25 minutes. And then we have a plenary discussion for the remaining half hour or so. So what else is there to consider? This session will be recorded for various reasons, so that others can have access to it, and so that many of us can go back up and reflect on it for wider dissemination as well, and so on. Although it will not be disseminated beyond MenEngage unless we can develop an edited down version, which would only be disseminated through the Countering Backlash program. Now, all questions, as is alluded to, will not be addressed or may not be addressed, but do carry them forward in this symposium, and do look out for forthcoming sessions in this series. The next session is likely to be in February. We're still finalizing dates between Sinead Nolan, ourselves, and some other people, some of who may be on this call, this session, hopefully. Okay, so finally, as with all sessions at the Ubuntu Symposium, keep the principles in mind, be mindful, be respectful in your interventions, and try to be inclusive in your language. And I will, at this point, I will hand over to the first conversation between India and Europe, starting with Sana Contractor in New Delhi. So over to you, Sana. The floor is yours.
Hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm based out of New Delhi at the moment. I am working with the Center for Health and Social Justice on a research project on countering backlash, and I'll be drawing on some of that work for this presentation today. I have worked closely with the women's movements in India, many of them, over the past 15 odd years. And I'm also drawing somewhat from my experience of having done that and being part of this field for a long time. I won't get into an exposition and a description of how backlash is operating in India today, because that would make for a much longer conversation and might get a bit too granular, which may not be of particular interest. But I want to what I want to do is present how I understand some of the key features of how backlash is playing out. If I think about the review that we've done, we've very obviously looked at the kinds of backlash which we've seen in recent times, ranging from outright violence, whether in actual physical contact, in online spaces, in the form of defamation and so on. But we've also seen fairly insidious forms of backlash, including co-optation and appropriation of language and erosion of agendas. And from what I can make of it, I think there are 4 or 5 points to keep in mind when we talk about backlash against gender equality agendas in India. The first and probably the most obvious, especially at this time, is the fact that backlash is deeply intersectional. And that does not just mean that it looks different for different kinds of women and men, but also that the axes of power that are playing at the same time are quite complex, and they interact with each other in different ways. So if I were to take the example of queer rights, for instance, we've seen the decriminalization of homosexuality in India in the last 5 to 6 years. But then if you were to look a little deeper into it and ask, who does this really benefit and what kind of protections does it really provide, you find that they are largely protections of privacy and identity, but not so much about social protections, not so much about protection from violence and so on. So that there is a certain caste and class character to the kinds of protections that policy reform or law reform has also provided, even though it is a long-standing struggle and no doubt an important struggle. But a more granular examination of it shows you that for queer folk within the movement, also the way the changes in law and reform play out for, say, a cisgender male are very different from the way they look for a trans person of a different caste. So, and that's just one example. But if you think about, say, Adivasi rights and women who are struggling for forest rights, it does not neatly fall into a patriarchal framework of understanding. And so our first takeaway from our review was that we have to look beyond the framework of patriarchy to make sense of the kind of backlash that women and others are facing at this time. And so we find the language of gender subordination perhaps more useful than necessarily patriarchal backlash. The second thing that we see very clearly is that the manifestations of backlash have started to become quite insidious. And I suppose in a lot of ways they have always been. So there is outright violence, but the co-optation of ideas, not just of gender equality, but also more liberal ideas of equality per se, or in India, for instance, secularism. What really constitutes this idea is also being challenged. And it does not mean the same thing for everybody. And the sort of transformation of discourse due to that is something that has a deep impact on women, but also on issues of gender per se and the conversation around gender per se, because in some ways the idea of gender equality is accepted, but what does it mean, and what does um, women's rights mean is also very different for very different people. And alongside that, you find that there's a great amount of tokenism. So for instance, we had the announcement of very expansive maternity benefits a few years ago, but if you examine it more closely, it applies for one child, and the budgetary allocations are absolutely meager. So there's a lot of hue and cry about how we've provided maternity benefits, but then the entire move is rendered useless for most folks because it applies to only one child and it does not have enough resource allocation. The third thing that I think has been, and this is particularly relevant to the conversation on masculinities, is that one of the ways in which we see masculinities play out is through the way in which central concerns of women's rights have become battlegrounds for political actors and communities as well. And we saw this with the criminalization of triple talaq in India a few years ago, ostensibly to protect Muslim women's rights, but these struggles have not risen overnight, and they have their root in pre-colonial times. When you see it in light of the fact of these paternalistic civilizing missions that India's colonial history is imbued with, you find that the question of gender has always been contested by different kinds of patriarchy, seeking to define tradition. And rather than it being a secular struggle for women's rights as individuals or subjects of the state, these have typically been about what constitutes tradition and the quote unquote modernizing of tradition itself. And in some ways, that contestation has continued right from the time of age at marriage and consent in the 1920s all the way to now, where we talk about personal laws. And although we say that women have certain rights under the Constitution of India, they are still being circumscribed through tradition. So
Okay,
some of these.
Could you wrap up in 1 minute?
Yes, I will. The last point that I wanted to make is that the roots of erosion of gender agendas are not just local. They have a strong global trend in that the way that development is practiced and the way gender equality has been practiced has changed quite a bit, especially through the 80s and 90s, starting in the 80s, but soon after as well. And this has happened alongside neoliberalism. So we found ourselves in a movement where we are constantly viewing the state as the chief arbiter, and we've adopted a sort of developmental activism, but at the cost of grassroots activism in a lot of ways. And that has had backlash in various ways. One, because we don't have a strong grassroots base, but also because the structures with which we operate have become so governmentalized that our field of action is quite restricted. So I'll stop over there and hear from Eva, and then perhaps we can come back.
Thank you very much, Sana. So Eva, can we now hear from you for some 5 minutes-ish? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So although we are working in different places, I will try to concentrate more from a Europe perspective. And first of all, I want to say that I agree with absolutely most of what Sana says. So we are more going to say it in different ways, but also to show that the last point on the global perspective is really, really true. I think that we from Kvinna, we have written lots of reports on this subject, but we were looking at the anti-gender trend as organized in the beginning of 2000. I think we saw it first. The first places we saw it was at the UN, where you could very well see as soon as it was a discussion about women's rights, you also had the opposition very much focusing then on sexual and reproductive health and rights. But if I look right now, I sometimes think that COVID-19, the anti-gender trends, shrinking space and nationalism are playing at each other's strengths. There are so many things, and they are feeding each other. We see a lot of different policies that are sometimes made because of the pandemic, even if it hasn't got anything to do with the pandemic, but also a lot of different kinds of governments that take this opportunity to actually reintroduce laws that has created a lot of demonstrations, as people cannot be outside demonstrate as much when it's locked down. So there is a lot of things happening, and I think we will see an even more backlash when it comes to sort of the space for different voices. And I also think, because we are working, you can also see how it comes in with who has really the power in different countries. I would like to just give a short example, both from Georgia and from Georgia, the country, and Serbia and North Macedonia. When it was the Orthodox Easter, it was during one of the waves of COVID, and the governments first said that they didn't want the churches to have any, whatever that is called, masses, I think it's called. But the church leaders, the religious leaders, said that they needed to have the masses. In Georgia, they actually said that if they didn't have it, everybody who didn't go would go to hell, basically. So it was also a bit of a stress on people that they should go, no matter of the restrictions that were in place then. So instead of taking the discussion with the churches, what the governments in these places did was, well, in Georgia, no one was allowed to go by car if they were not a priest, which would lessen the amount of people who actually could go to churches. In North Macedonia, they just had a complete lockdown and no one could leave their apartments for, I think it was 78 hours during Easter. So that means that the religious nationalism, if you want, becomes such an important part of your identity. So that goes before everything else. And I also think that even though, like here in Sweden, I would say that the absolute, everybody is just talking about COVID and the pandemic, that have left less room for the nationalist in Sweden to get media attention. But in other places, we have seen that the polarization has even become more and more, become stronger. And if you add conflict, I would say like just the latest where we are working in Armenia and Azerbaijan that had the war around Nagorno-Karabakh. When you add conflict, the concept of who is a real man becomes very, very narrow. And when soldiers comes back during a pandemic, when soldiers come back and nothing is done with them, violence is quite widespread. And when you are also in lockdown together with a man, you have nowhere to go. And when you add the fact that nationalism becomes even stronger in a conflict situation, I would say, so you can't really say anything against this man because he's a war hero. So who are you to speak? So you have different layers that comes in. But I also wanted to say a couple of other things while I still have the time. I would echo Sanna about words. Oh, 1 minute. Wow, that goes really fast. Okay. I think we need to look at what the anti-gender movement and others are doing with words, both that they are filling it with other things than it usually, like what Sanna said. I think intersectionality is another word that we have heard is being misused a lot. We have heard this, that our traditional way of women's rights is like this, usually has nothing to do with women's rights. But it's also true that we do see that it's more and more difficult. If you look at EU, there were some people working close to the Swedish government that said, now it's not even just hard to talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights. It's also really, really difficult to even talk about gender equality within the EU, because you have many populist, nationalistic government there as well. So what is left? So because I will just quit some of it, and then I'm just going to say one of my favorites. It's very easy to say that you are for women's rights. It doesn't cost anything. And it literally doesn't cost anything because the money is not there. And I think this is also, if we really want to counter the backlash, we also need to see where the money is going. The anti-gender movement is well funded and well organized. The women's rights organization, and particularly the feminist women's rights organization, gets absolutely almost nothing soon because it just gets less and less. The money that goes for gender equality and gender mainstreaming goes to big organizations, international organizations, mainstream organizations, but it doesn't go to the feminist women's organization. And if we really want to do something about it, they also need to have the funds to strategize. Because as one women human rights defender said to me not long ago, she said, I'm not sure at all that this anti-gender trend has anything to do with gender. It's a want for power. And in our patriarchal structure, they saw us as an easy target. It was easy for them to make people hate us. And she is a women human rights defender. And I think that is also true. So we shouldn't think that it has all to do with an anti-gender trend. It has to do with power structure. And we need to look at that more, I think.
Okay, so thank you so much, Eva. That's probably a great moment for you two to go into a bit more of a conversation, comparing and contrasting. So Sana, you've been listening to Eva now for the last 5+ minutes. Maybe you have an immediate question to Eva, and Eva, you might want to think about a question back to Sana as well. So Sana, do you have any questions for Eva about Europe and or reflections? You are on mute at the moment, so if you can unmute.
Sorry about that. So I was thinking about what Eva was saying about the pandemic and how it's taken away screen time from nationalists and toned down the rhetoric, perhaps. And I see something quite different happening here, which is that there's absolutely no scope for action, for direct street action. And so a lot is happening within the legislative rooms, and there's really no way to exercise any sort of protest at all. And so a lot of backlash is in fact playing out at this time, not necessarily it does not necessarily look like gender backlash, but these are gross economic reforms, labor reforms, environmental reforms taking place because nobody can say anything about it. And unlike the United States, where in some perverse way the protest against a lockdown was legitimized by the leadership. That is not the case in India at all. In India, if you're out on the streets, you'll be in prison. There's absolutely no support for direct street action. So a lot is happening in terms of backlash as we speak, because there is very little that one can do when one is locked down. There is, of course, online action and so on and so forth, and several organizations have done that and have faced repercussions because of that as well. But that's another story. But I see quite a different thing playing out in India. And now on the question of intersectionality, I have a grouse there as well, because I completely agree. It's almost turned into a siloization of interest groups. So you have the trans groups, the disability rights groups, the ethnic groups, the religious groups, but the fact that intersectionality is looking at axes of power and not necessarily groups of people necessarily it's almost contrary to what we understand as intersectionality. And perhaps a part of it is also due to the fact that there is so much focus on representational politics right now, and you feel happy seeing women, few women, but women certainly in places of power, and then that is projected as gender equality or as race equality or whatever, but that's not necessarily what it is. So I think a more complicated understanding of what is happening in the space is required, especially for intersectionality, because its expansive meanings often get reduced to something that is a checkbox, essentially.
Great. So Eva, do you have any reflections on that or questions for Sana?
Well, we could talk for a long time, I think, and both with the things that are common. I mean, again, I think I agree with most of what is said. So it is sort of, and I would actually stress that I didn't mean when I said it was in Sweden, they don't get so much media attention. I would say that in most places, street action is not sort of seen as what you want, even if there are more street actions that one could think of during the pandemic as well, I think. I think that we need to, I think the nationalists are getting more, and I think one of the things that from a Europe perspective, when everybody has a computer almost, has been a lot of time for hate. So the ones following on different, and you just wonder why you are reading everything people are writing when you do not believe it. I think more and more people are in their own bubble of information right now, and that is really, really dangerous. And I can see it in Sweden, but I can also see it in the places where we are working. I think in the end it will, even if I really, and I would like actually Sana to say something more about that, is that the backlash is not only the violence and the very obvious one, but it's also the nitty-gritty way of sort of almost looking like it's good, but it's really bad. But I think that all this hate speech that goes on now so much on the internet, and I know there is a lot of people who, I mean, but for women human rights defenders and LGBTQI activists, it is specifically a lot. And as long as the governments are not saying anything about it, it becomes almost a carte blanche for violence against them once we are moving around, because the violence is already there. The violence online is happening, but it can also translate to violence offline, I would say. But Sana, if you would say more about that, if we have time.
Actually, just on time, we are running out of time in terms of the conversation, but maybe we can take a couple of questions from the audience, and you can both reflect on that very quickly. So Chloe, would you be able to pick a couple of questions?
Sure. We just have the one so far, but it's quite a big one to unpack.
That's good. We're short on time anyway, so let's start with that question and give Sana and Eva a shot at it each.
Sure. So it's relating to Eva's last point. It's a question to both Sana and Eva. So Savita has asked, is it indeed gender backlash or power backlash? The power struggle is happening not only between genders, but is also happening between different groups.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and I mean, we also tend to caricaturize backlash as something that's coming only from right-wing groups, but a lot of the language and the frameworks have been created by, at least in India, by political actors of all hues, including the left. And I'm not talking about historically, of course, historically, but also in recent times, we've seen the left take positions and use women's issues as the battleground for scoring points. So it's not just a question of the far right or the ethno-nationalists who do that, but it's definitely not a struggle between genders only, and perhaps not at all in some cases. But it has to be unpacked as to why, for instance, in India, did the left government take such a strong stand on allowing women's entry into temples, for instance. In a lot of cases, these are political battles that are playing out. If you simplify it a lot, it sounds like men fighting with each other over who gets to be the better man, That's, of course, a very, very simplified version of it. But it's very important to remember that these are often actors at different ends of the ideological spectrum who also espouse similar sorts of and who contribute to backlash in a lot of ways. And in India, it's a historical thing. So we cannot look at what is happening right now divorced from what has happened when this government was not in power, for instance. And it's important to remember that, so that our response to it is not short term, but it is more long standing.
Great, thank you. So Eva, in terms of Europe and the way it looks like here, this is clearly much more than about gender, I guess the question is asking. And in what way can we think of it as power, backlash of power, about power?
But I think that if you really are looking, I think Sana has talked about it as well. Women, whether you look gender, where you look at we almost always look at two big groups. And I think if we don't have a power analysis almost to anything, we will not understand the roots or what is driving people. Why is this agenda? Why is it so big with all these big international meetings on family? Why is it happening? Is it really because they hate women's rights? Is it because that would be easy? I think it's much more difficult to pinpoint what it's really about. And I think if you do not look at the power that comes with it, the access to resources that comes with power, the access to being the one setting the agenda. There are so many things. And I think with the fake news that is really, we are increasingly bad at finding the right information. We are increasingly, and I would echo Sana, this is not far right, really bad people. We are all there. We are in our bubbles. We are taking in information that is just what we want to hear. And I think this is going to polarize us even more. And I think we have been late. I'm almost laughing when they are surprised that Poland and Hungary are now blocking the EU's budget. Why wouldn't they? They have kind of not given a shit for years, and the EU have let them. We are late.
Okay, we are late indeed. We are also late, well, we're not actually late. We're right on time in terms of the agenda. So that's probably a good point to shift our attention over to the axis of south to north in terms of geography, at least. Not too literally, but hear from Uganda and the United States about backlash linked to issues of, well, to some extent, race and colonialism, but also to politics of different kinds in the two different places. So can I hand over to David Chimba to speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll hear from Alan for 5 minutes. So over to you, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Yaka. And I take the challenge to speak for 5 minutes. over this very grand topic. I think what I will do in the next 4 minutes is just to point out to two modest concerns which we need to keep in mind as we speak about gender justice and what is at stake now. I think we need to thrust back gender justice in history. And when we say history from where I am, colonialism looms large. And it is a prism through which I want to kind of read the family and what has happened to it so that we may appreciate the current anti-gender ideology which is going on, particularly since the dawn of this millennia. So I think there's something fundamental which took place with regard to the ways in which our understanding and our articulation of family has been. By and large, one will argue, and reading the scholarly literature which exists on the continent, one comes to see that most of the pre-colonial African society had family as a sphere of deep negotiation. Family was the sphere of negotiation, a sphere where gender was a political category which was with the realm of custom. And so we see a shift from that realm of negotiation, gender as custom, which means really custom is in motion and custom is changing and custom is very much adaptive, to family as a domain of conformity. And with family as a domain of conformity, we see now gender as depoliticized, and it is relegated to the realm of the customary. So the conceptual shift from custom to customary is a very important one. And so family now is seen in the eye of the patriarch, this patriarch who by and large is not alone, is mobilizing alliance across the sex divide, age divide, labor and so on, and religious divide. And now women in this particular moment of colonial rule, women are turned into what I will call patriarchal feminists, who are doing the policing of observing the conformities, and the rest of their role is reduced to reporting non-conformists now for disciplining. And so we find very much women enroll into this new mode of governance, which is really depoliticizing gender and freezing it into the realm of the customary, of culture. And so the second point, and the last I want to make, is that we see now marriage, which pre-colonially has been catering for all sorts of non-heteronormative unions, polyandry, polygyny, male daughters, female husbands, etc. It's now all cut off, and all we have is now heteronormative alliances as the only expression of matrimony, of course undergirded by a deep capitalist political economy, at the core of which property is sacrosanct. And so there is, I think, the seeds of the anti-gender ideology and the whole castigation of family in the eyes of Garden of Eden, an Adam and an Eve. That's what I want to say for now. Thank you.
If you still have another minute, if you want to add any thoughts about what the actual pushback is looking like in Uganda today.
I think, and all right. Thank you for the minutes. So the pushback we look at as the pushback looks like this retaliation to what I will call something we started in 1585 with Pope Gregory the 13th, who is issuing the Constitution of Populis, which is like the whole text on the marriage of infidels. All those who are out of the heteronormative forms, they are called infidels. And so one has to read the pushback now as a refusal to be categorized as infidel, a refusal to be conformist in the language of the Vatican. And this has 5 centuries of history. And people are pushing back against this 5 centuries of history, which starts at the moment of imperial colonialism. And we need to keep in mind that.
Okay. So thank you for that, David. Maybe Alan will have some questions for you later, but I'll pass over to Alan to give us a perspective from the US and looking at what's going on with backlash there. So over to you, Alan, for the next 5 minutes. You're on mute at the moment.
Thanks, Jurka. Sorry about that. So I'm going to try and make 5 points in 5 minutes, which is going to be a bit of a challenge. It's based on the work that I did for Oxfam America. I did some work looking at the far right and masculinities, the use of masculinities by the far right, which was a literature review looking at research on the far right in Europe and North America. So the first point is that the idea of the male protector is being reinvigorated by a racialization of masculinities. So the racialization of the sexual threat of the male other is a significant part of the far right discourse around men needing to step up and protect their families. Trump invoked, Mexican rapists flooding the country when he announced his candidacy in 2016. And certainly in Western Europe, a lot of the anti-immigrant rhetoric by the far right uses this image of the sexualized, the sexual threat from the male other invading the country. The second point would be that threat is linked to, and the kind of the protector role is linked to a property relation. So women and children as the property of men obviously is long central to patriarchy, and women's lack of control over property remains a significant aspect of gender inequality worldwide. But this relationship between property and the protector, the far right is scaling from the family to the nation. I think in that kind of ethno-nationalist imaginary, where the male needs to protect the nation as family. And I think a key point to note here is that is not only gendered, but it's always racialized as well. So whiteness, if you go all the way back to 17th century Virginia plantations, whiteness emerged as a concept as property, in relation to property. So white meant being able to have property in oneself and to own the property of those deemed non-white. So that demarcation between white and non-white was a property relation. And so we need to think that protector role in relation to that property relation. Brenda Banner has talked about Trump and other expressions of far-right politics, gender politics, as a kind of possessive nationalism. And I think you could look, which is linking that protector and property relation. And I think you can think about that. If you look at certain kind of far-right messaging in parts of Europe, you see that possessive nationalism even framed in terms of defending gender equality. So we're defending gender equality from the primitive gender practices of the immigrant. So again, it's racialized in terms of the distinction, but it's co-opts, and this is building on the stuff that Sana and Eva talked about. It co-opts this language of gender equality to say that what we have in Europe is gender equality, which is implicitly racialized, and it is being threatened by the primitive, in inverted commas, gender practices of those who are coming in to our country or region. There's also kind of civilizational dimension to that. So we need to think that what does that racialized, how does that racialized gender equality play into the backlash? Because the vision of gender relations invoked is deeply heteronormative, implicitly cisgendered, usually a kind of parity between the man and the woman in the heteronormative family. So I think you can read that framing of gender relations in terms of backlash as well. I think the fourth point would be to also thinking about the kind of malleability of these race and gendered relations would be to look at the ways in which masculinity is being invoked as a form of cross-racial solidarity on the far right. So what we have seen, in this latest election, one of the demographics that Trump increased his vote with was men of color. And there have been, a growing, if small, body of research looking at people of color, but particularly men of color on the right, and their involvement in far-right politics. And there's a great book called Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity by Hosang and Lowndes, and I'll quote from their book. There is a growing tangled relationship between renewed forms of authoritarian nationalism and a masculinized version of multiculturalism, one that selectively incorporates some people of color into a nationalist framework. Performed as patriarchal traditionalism, online ultra-misogyny, or street brawling bravado, masculinity bridges racial difference for populist, fascist, and even white nationalist politics. So the gender conservatism of the far right is bound up with certain notions of masculinity that can operate cross-racially to build cross-racial alliances on the far right. So the fifth and final point would then be that when we think about the anti-patriarchal work that we want to do in terms of countering backlash, that also has to be an anti-racist work as well. And what that looks like in different places will obviously depend on those contexts. But certainly from where I am in North America and where I come from in Britain, thinking, male supremacy and white supremacy together is imperative. That was me. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Alan. Right on time. Apologies for leaving my mic on mute. Having time to listen to that, David. So we go into the conversation between the two of you. Have you any reflections or thoughts about what Alan has just said? And then Alan can respond to.
Yeah. I think it echoes back Alan's point on what will the struggle for gender justice look like moving forward as a struggle against race. It's very much resonating with what the struggle for gender justice in particular case of Uganda will look like. I will also say it will be a struggle against coloniality. Mm-hmm. So to flip to bring Alan's contribution into a binary mode of thinking, what is race for Alan here will be coloniality here for us. So on the one hand, and I think this is complementary, because I think on the one hand we will need a de-racialization of the society, which is going to be a gender just society. But that can only happen when you have a decolonized society. So it is a twofold struggle. We need a deeply decolonized society and a de-racialized society for a gender just outcome. And I think I cannot agree anymore. And this solidarity across race and class, which has been feeding the diets of the far right, needs to be recomposed. And we need another solidarity. We need a decolonial and de-racialized solidarity to fight for gender justice. And so far, we do not have much room created for that kind of movement.
Yeah.
All we have are small islands of containerized struggles that are in the end meaningless in output.
Yeah. So, Alan, what's your thoughts on that, or any other question or comment on David's?
No, I thought David's point about custom to customary, custom being implicitly kind of a negotiation which is about power and politics, to customary being depoliticized, was really fascinating. I'd love to hear more about how that, what does that look like in terms of kind of the post-colonial Ugandan state, and in what ways is the state using customary relations to maintain itself? You know, how does that work?
A good question, Alan. Well, you see, we have what we call the codes. For example, if you look at the policy framework and the legal framework, for that matter, let me talk about the legal framework undergirding gender norms in this society. We have, for example, take something. We have the penal code, for example, which still criminalizes some of the offenses as against nature.
Mm-hmm.
So against nature, crimes against nature, all this list of sexualities that are criminalized. So the custom does one thing. The custom is our plane where we understanding the shifts and the negotiation that take place, because nothing is set, nothing is cast in stone.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is really cast in stone as far as custom is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
What the customary does, particularly through codification, is that it solidifies an otherwise fluid motional construct into a forever that is. So the customary is it naturalizes custom. A particular custom, and this matter will be a particular patriarchal custom, which is naturalized, and that's it. We are men, and men are supposed to be that. We cannot imagine men being raped and all that kind of thing. It is the naturalization of the custom which is the big tug of war. And we've had a whole struggle in this contemporary Uganda. Feminist struggle really is about revising the codification of the custom into which made this customary.
Well, yeah, because I had a question about what are the ways in which it's kind of distorting feminist struggle, if that becomes the kind of terrain of the struggle. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, not distorting. It invites feminists to it invites the current feminists, particularly the women movement, to be a little deeper in terms of their concerns, because if all they're fighting is a form. And form is a new expression of the customary, right? We are tired of this particular expression of the customary. We need a different expression of the customary. That is a form struggle, but we need a content struggle. That an invitation to rethink the customary and take the custom.
Yeah. Excellent. So can we then? We have some questions for the audience, so I'll ask Chloe to come in and kind of manage these. In the meantime, first question was to Alan, if you could just give us the book title again.
I'm gonna put it in the chat.
Yeah, if you could put that in the chat line, would be brilliant. So Chloe, could you pick or summarize or synthesize the questions? The first one is to both speakers.
Sure. And they're all quite related in terms of the shift from a colonial society to a decolonized society. So the first one is, why do colonized and colonizer countries have the same resistance/approach? Who learnt from who, I wonder? And then the latter two relate to kind of the shifts. So what would a decolonized gender equal society look like? And that decolonization is implying that something will take the place of colonial thought. So what that is could be contentious. So if either of you want to respond.
You go, David, because I'm typing out my book title.
Start, David.
I was saying, go ahead, Alan, as I type and speaking. It's very interesting, the question on who learned from who, right? Well, let me say this in passing, that we have Mahmoud Mamdani's latest book, Neither Settler Nor Native, which has just come out just last week, I think. He's telling us that the US, for example, is a deeply colonial is a settler colonial state, and in its founding moment, it is a deeply settler colonialism as the DNA of its political imaginary. So, and Germany will PQ from US, particularly Nazi Germany did PQ, and then South Africa drew its inspiration from the settler colonial states, apartheid South Africa, I mean, and the current Israeli states, the Israeli states. And so it's not who learned from who. It is some undergirding thoughts that I think has been particularly constructed around the mercantile era that has been sustained throughout, and it's percolated around. So we need to look at how the idea and its articulation has percolated around the globe, and not just who learned from who. That's what I will say. And so this convincingly invite us to look at the struggle for gender justice as a global struggle as well. Global struggle articulated differently locally, definitely. It's the global struggle, and its articulation will be local, but its ambition has to keep the global focus, because if we think these are just small domains of how Uganda is peculiar and very, very different, and the approach is different, then we lose sight of this undergirding idea that has sustained itself for past 5 centuries. And so very important to have this kind of discussion across the continent, across race, across age, across times too. It is not a particularly contemporary discussion, and to circumscribe it to the contemporariness is to lose a great deal of insights about what is at stake. And so we need to historicize both the patriarchal power, and also countering it. We need to historicize it. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Alan, what are your thoughts on those questions?
Well, I strongly agree with what David just said about the historicizing and the need for a global perspective. You know, the decolonizing project has to be a global project. I mean, I think if you look at kind of just historically, you know, policing practices that were trialed in the colonies were brought back to the colonial centers in London and you know, in the US. So there's a back and forth between you know, colonial periphery and colonial center historically, and you know, the police in the US are learning from the Israeli Defense Force, and the Israeli Defense Force is buying weapons from the US. So, you know, there's this back and forth globally between oppressive structures that we need to take account of, definitely.
Okay. Are there other questions to Alan and David?
Yeah, it was related to the shift. So what would a decolonized gender equal society look like? And then relatedly, kind of what would take the place of colonial thought? And just the note that can be quite contentious.
Yeah. So does Alan or David, would you like to pontificate or react, project what it would look like?
This is very interesting. I think we are selling yeast here, not making bread. I don't have bread. It's a very important question. We are ill prepared to answer it in the clearest terms. But I would say we know what we know. At least we should learn how the colonized gender society was, and I think we have not gotten there yet, really, because we have gotten aspects of it, and our what is within our reach is a deep study of how a really colonized gender worked and how it worked. And this, I think we have not exhausted that. And if we can exhaust that, then we shall already be maybe at 50% on the journey toward how to undo that. But bottom line, we know that a colonial articulation of gender depoliticized gender struggle, and it depoliticized it in a way that I'm not saying politics in terms of constituencies of demand on rights and duty bearer. I'm talking about politics as the where power is negotiated and redistributed and engaged. So colonial articulation of gender depoliticizes and it puts it in the realm of culture in a very modernist sense here. So that's the big struggle. So we need to repoliticize gender justice, and a decolonized gender society will be that one which repoliticizes back and refuses to naturalize norms and conformities.
Great, thank you, Alan. Do you have closing thoughts before the break on this?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think that the future is to be created, but there will be, I think, in there will be things about collective care, solidarity, self-determination, democratic decision making. We could talk about the values and practices that would make up that vision of a decolonized future. But we need to be talking more about that, and to David's point, we need to be understanding much better where we've come from in order to do that.
Okay, those are good thoughts, and perhaps also thoughts to keep for the plenary discussion later on. I like some of your comments about both the long-term understanding of history and the global nature of this, which are themes we'll return to after the break in the third conversation between Denise and Sonia. But we did say we were going to have a comfort break and give people 20 odd minutes to make your cups of tea, go to the loo, whatever you need to do. And we will be back a couple of minutes before the hour. So it would be about before half past. So 28 minutes past the hour. In 20 minutes, we will reconvene. Okay, so feel free to take your breaks, switch off your microphones and cameras and so on, and we will come back on stream in 20 minutes. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.
All right.
We are more or less ready to begin again. Continue, rather. So, first of all, thank you very much, Sana, Eva, David, and Alan. I thought those cross-regional conversations were really helpful to put a bit of texture and localized reality to these various phenomena we're seeing. Some interesting themes coming out as well in terms of whether it be in terms of nation conflict and defense and or property indeed, and colonializing discourses and frameworks and policy and so on. I'm not going to attempt to summarize them now, but rather use it as an opportunity to pass over to Denise and Sonia, because we're now taking perhaps the longer view and the big picture, picking up on some of those points made earlier, that we can't look at this without history. We have to look at it as much more than simply about gender equality politics. There are other things that come into it, but it is impacting on gender. And the one common factor perhaps is that all of these backlash scenarios seem to use gender equality, identities, and those issues as sites of contestations. So on that note, I will hand over to, first of all, Denise to speak for 5 minutes, and then Sonia for 5 minutes like before, and then a conversation between the two of you. So are you okay to start and take us into your provocation, Denise?
Okay, fine. In that case, I'll start by taking issue with the term backlash here, because it generally implies resistance by those in power to attempts to change the status quo, or even in a stronger way, the use of coercive power to regain lost power as capacity. Now, if we consider that the 20th century, even starting from the 19th, was a century of emancipatory struggles, anti-colonial civil rights, women's equality, sexual minorities, it is very clear to me that these rights are very far from having been achieved. So what we're talking about with backlash is, if at all, a relative or perceived loss of power by groups who continue to be very powerful, but who have been able to market an anti-gender ideology in populist tones, saying that the whole gender agenda was Western, elitist, etc. And what I'm going to do is tell you how we got there in 3 points. Point number one, I'm starting in the 70s. When the UN and all the other agencies started globalizing the gender agenda, one of the results was that apparatuses were created throughout the world to monitor the results. Personnel was assigned for this task. Now, when we look worldwide at how that happened, we see two things. First of all, the total co-optation of the gender agenda by power holders who had absolutely no intention to promote gender equality in the first place, the colonization of these cadres by women of powerful families, princesses, spouses of heads of state, and so on. As a result, of course, especially in countries that were plainly authoritarian and non-democratic, there was a complete sort of overlap between the internationally promoted gender agenda and the usually very corrupt regimes that have no popular base. So this is perversion number one. Perversion number two, which started a little bit later, we're talking about the 80s, was the neoliberal wave attacking states that were to different degrees welfarist and substituting provision through NGOs. So what we have is an NGOization of social movements, including women's movements. This is to a lesser extent for LGBTI because that came later, but there is an NGOization. While this NGOization and technocratization of the gender agenda propagated through gender training, etc., was going on, simultaneously other actors were filling the gaps in the social justice agenda, like the Catholic Church, fighting against odious third world debts, Muslim Brotherhood affiliates coming in with their own agenda at the grassroots. So the first, as it were, depoliticization was compounded now by a fracture between movements which were base movements originally in many countries becoming alienated in that way. In my part of the world, the third final alienation came with the war on terror, where there was a split among feminists in the north on feminism when Madame Bush declared they were in Afghanistan to save Muslim women, as you recall. And that created, obviously, this whole discourse about feminism as imperialism, okay? Which to a certain extent meets somewhere decolonial critiques. And of course has been disastrous from the point of view of women's movements in the regions concerned, because I worked in Afghanistan, so I can speak about that situation, because the women who had been struggling very hard to achieve minimal rights, like the right to education, the right not to be forcibly married, before puberty and stuff like that, they could then be criminalized and demonized as somehow being fellow travelers, okay, of this situation. So I think that these three very perverse developments facilitated the work that the Vatican had been doing since the early 1990s, and which found voice for the first time in 94. You will remember the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, where an international coalition featuring the Vatican and various Muslim clerics were there to stop any platform for action what they were not bothered about the detail. The Catholics were worried about abortion. Muslim clerics were worried about things like female genital mutilation or underage marriages. But the principle was that issues pertaining to gender, body politics, etc., should be removed from the sphere of open, public, democratic deliberation and put in the hands of the people who can tell us what the doctrinal imperatives are. Okay, so there was a sort of, in other words, various actors with various agendas wanted to remove this issue from a sphere of open deliberation, open public discourse, which is another form of depoliticization, because we can not talk about these issues with the language of public good or whatever it is, but with the language of virtue and sin, okay? So it's hands off. So basically, I feel that these are the things that have greatly facilitated. And the reversal of the backlash obviously has to do with undoing each and every one of these pitfalls that have led us to the point where we are here, one by one, basically. That is why this history, which starts in the early 70s, is extremely important. And I think the anti-gender agenda has been in the making for at least 3 decades. I don't believe it's a product of the 2000s. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that resonates very much with what a lot of people have been wondering and feeling and so on. And I believe leads quite nicely onto Sonia's topic. And I'll hand over to you now, Sonia.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. This conversation is really very inspiring. I want to begin with a disclaimer, which I think is important in this conversation, which is that whenever I use the term gender or sexuality, intersectionality is always implied. Sometimes we forget to say so. I always think of gender and sexuality as racialized and race as sexed and gendered. So I think it's important to make that clear to begin with. I want to pull the same thread that Denise has started with, which is calling us to interrogate the notion of backlash. Denise has already provided us with very insightful reflections. I want to extend what she said about the long term, or la longue durée, the long course, the long view of what we are witnessing now. Although it is true that in the last 10 years or so, we have seen an intensification of anti-gender, anti-abortion agitation in various regions around the world, but in relation to gender, this is more strongly felt in Latin America and Europe, and now after Trump in the US as well. Despite that, these forces are neither reactive, they are not just reacting, nor they are strictly contemporary, as Denise has reminded. They have long course genealogies in both the religious and the secular political ideological domains. It's not just about religion. Such as, and Denise has called attention to that, at least from the Catholic cradle of anti-gender discourse. This goes back, in fact, it's not so much Cairo itself, but it's the transition between Cairo and Beijing. This is 25 years back in the preparatory committee for Beijing, when the gender trouble of the Vatican erupted. By accident, I was there to see it, so I'm sort of witness of the Vatican gender trouble. Or else, if we go a little bit further back, also in the 70s, in the US, the moral majority movement was propelled by the Republicans as a response to what they saw as excessive liberalism, secularization, and for sure abortion rights and the first claims of homosexual rights. But we can still pull further back. In Western Europe, for example, I just think that a very interesting excavation project is to look back into the disputes, the intellectual disputes between Edmund Burke and Mary Wollstonecraft in the late 18th century. You're going to find roots of what we are witnessing now that can be recollected in that conflict. You know? And in my region, as in Africa, as so insightfully addressed by David, we cannot understand the current state of anti-abortion and anti-gender politics without retracing back the deep colonial imprint of Catholic, patriarchal, racist, predating colonization. Or else, in my region, the post-war, post-Second War expansion of conservative evangelical religious forces, churches, that had been evicted from China when the revolution took over. From a Latin American point of view, this is not a minor point, because here, as in Eastern Europe, anti-gender discourse is always linked up with anti-Marxist accusations and discourses. And these evangelical forces were highly, deeply anti-communist. Most importantly, perhaps, as also noted by Denise, and examined in depth by Wendy Brown in her last book that I strongly recommend to be read, which is The Ruins of Neoliberalism, we have to consider the deep imprint of natural gender binary and the central protective role of the heteronormative family in early 20th century neoliberal thinking. These ideas of the binary gender, the natural difference between men and women, the natural protective nature of the family are ingrained in neoliberal ideology. And we cannot circumvent neoliberalism in our conversation. And as Eva has said, we have to remind that these forces are not just about gender and sexuality. They are about that. But their aim is to restore or preserve culturally specific or imagined gender and sexuality orders. This restoration or preservation is at the center of their political project that, as Eva has said, is about power or the political order itself. And lastly, in relation to that topic, I must say to Sana that I really appreciated your critical reflections on the limits of patriarchy as an universal explanatory category. And I think it's really productive to rescue our old category of subordination. I think we should revisit that possibility in the challenges we have in front of us. Do I have a little bit more of time, Jirka? Cannot hear.
Sorry, I have 1 more minute. You're a little over time, but just 1 minute, please.
So I just want to add one element about the nature of these forces or what they do, how they are conformed and what they do. As Denise reminded, they are really filling a void. The origin of this void may vary across regions and countries, but they are filling a void. They portray themselves in part, they are bottom up. They are not top down. But they are also transnationally connected. They are highly heterogeneous and flexible. They are ecumenical. They articulate both religious and secular forces. And their politics, as it has been mentioned, is fundamentally discursive. It's a politics of word, of semantics. But it's not just about cooptation. I would say that it comprises a strategy of perennial semiotic inversion. It's turning signifiers and significance up and down, as they have done with the accusation that feminist and gender are colonial. I think it's ironic that the Vatican will call us colonial. I mean, it's sort of almost pathetic. And we should try to understand how this grasps the imagination and the hearts and minds of people. No? But they are also a politics of effect. These empty signifiers that they throw into the public sphere articulates different meanings, but also sentiments, fear, anger, resentment, and pull all of that together to create new political publics. And most principally to incite the inertial conservatism of society, converting this conservative that is always there into political energy to take hold of power. And this is exactly what we have witnessed in my own country, regrettably, in the years between 2013 and 2018 that ended up with the catastrophic election of Jair Bolsonaro to the presidency. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much, Sonia. That is great. And thank you both for such clear presentations. As you've been listening, Denise, perhaps you want to start the conversation with Sonia with some reflection on her perspective?
I agree with basically everything she says. You know, she pushes back even further. You know, we are absolutely of one mind, but there is one thing I'd like to discuss with her and with everyone else, because we are being told that we have to repoliticize gender. Now, in my view, it's already repoliticized, but people don't realize it because they don't call it gender. What I think I am witnessing in the streets of Cairo, in the streets of Istanbul, in the youth protests that are about governance, that are anti-corruption, and so on, are also anti-patriarchal protests. I have no doubt about it. When you look at the symbolism, the art, the form of expression, what they are doing is that they are calling the bluff of the leader as patriarch, the leader as paterfamilias. They're saying, we don't need you. We know our own mind. And this is a unique moment, I don't know what Sonia thinks, for cross-gender alliances. Because we're talking about groups of men and women who are politically divided. You know, when you look at the Republican conservatives, full of women among them who are pro-life, etc. I mean, think of Phyllis Schlafly, you know, how long ago this woman was, you know, exactly. So I wonder, Sonia, what you think about this take on the situation.
No, first of all, I fully agree with you, and also with what David has said about the place of gender in the family domain in pre-colonial Africa. Gender is always political. I mean, it's not that gender has ever not been political. Even when gender mainstream becomes loose content and becomes something that it's almost nothing, it is political because it has been taken over by the state. So I think to emphasize the deeply political nature of gender and sexuality is something that we need to, maybe it should be our mantra. Don't forget that gender and sexuality are always political. As Gail Rubin has said a long time back, is the political economy of sex and gender. Let's go back to that piece of writing to remind us. Secondly, I want to discuss the question of the state that you have addressed in your critique of gender mainstreaming. David has raised the question about the colonial features of the state. And I just think that here we have a big issue, and I don't have easy responses for that, and I think this requires lots of conversation. What to do about the state? Because I think in the last 20 years or so, in our struggles, we have looked a lot or engaged a lot with the state to gain rights, but even to transform culture. And in that dynamics, we have lost sight of the deep colonial and biopolitical traits of modern states nation. We have left aside the recognition that the state is always a structure of domination, of the huge problem of monopoly of violence, and disciplining, which, for example, intersects with the very problematic question of feminist and even LGBT rights movements calling for criminalization, therefore calling for the state monopoly to come into the lives of people in social life. And I think that has become, I mean, particularly the arbitrary nature and the monopoly of violence of states has become very clear in the COVID crisis. I mean, it's one clear dimension of COVID, which is this eruption of states of exception. And this has become a major topic of discussion in intellectual and even activist circles. Huh? So this is a topic that we need to continue addressing. The question is, it's not an easy conundrum, because on the other hand, the state is also a source of protection. And what to do about that? Or else, if we think that our contingency is ultra neoliberalism with these unleashed forces of global capital, how to contain those forces without the state? So there's a big question there that I think connects with other difficult questions that have been raised in this discussion. But this is a paradox that needs to be named and continuously debated, though I don't have a clear response to that at this point.
So can I thank you? Those are fascinating perspectives. There's one thing that I'm wondering about in relation to both of your provocations, and perhaps some other provocations earlier, which is the use we're making of the term neoliberal and what we understand neoliberal to mean and be, whilst other commentators may argue that neoliberalism is over and that what we're now seeing is an illiberalism of a new neoconservative kind. But of course, this links to the political economy, globalization, and we're talking about the political economy of gender and sexuality. There were also things, a few statements about this being anti-Marxist in the deeper history. And I'd like to latch on to that idea and wondering, because we are seeing shifts in politics around what the social contract or the political economy should look like. So have you got any thoughts about, where is this heading in terms of, is it still relevant to talk about neoliberalism as part of this problem, or are we dealing with a new beast? And what is this issue about right and left and neo-Marxism, for example? Sorry, that wasn't particularly coherent, but maybe on question mark over what do we mean by neoliberalism? To what extent is this a right wing or a right and left issue? And how do we resolve those dilemmas?
Do you want to respond, Denise? I myself think that there's a conceptual confusion here that needs to be clarified. What is called illiberal democracy? I mean, this was crafted by Orban himself, sorry. Huh?
Yeah.
He was talking about liberal politics, liberal democracy. He was speaking about the political architecture of liberalism. He was not addressing the economic rationality or dimension of the architecture as a whole. When I talk about neoliberalism, I'm not speaking just about economic policies, and I always separate neoliberalism from the classical liberal political thinking, because I think this is incredibly necessary. Neoliberalism is a political rationality, an economic rationality, which has political dimensions. And I think this is why Wendy Brown has been so useful, at least for me, because she goes beyond the notion that neoliberalism is just about economic reforms or shrinking the state or privatization or tertiarization. It's about that, but it has another and more problematic effect, which is the erosion of democratic politics, because it shrinks the notion of rights to the right to vote, the right to have property, and the right to consume. And it destroys the political community because it does not consider the social a space of politicization. And we are when we are saying that gender is political, we are saying that gender and sexuality is political in the social realm. If that social realm is devoid of politics, because politics is restrained to the right to vote, the right to have property, and the right to consume, there is an effect, a political effect of neoliberalism on the politics of gender and sexuality. In addition, the other very problematic effect is not just the extreme individualization, that the impact on subjectivities, how neoliberal individuals locate and behave in the world. They don't see themselves anymore as citizens, as persons in relationality or interdependent human beings. They see themselves as just themselves and entrepreneurs. They are the capitalists of themselves. And I think this has also a very perverse impact on politics, broadly speaking, and the politics of gender and sexuality in particular. So I think here one key element comes not from Brown, but from Butler, which is the notion of interdependence, which I think is one concept that we should be looking at more closely and discussing in our conversations about.
Great. Denise, do you want to add anything to that?
Once again, I find myself agreeing with Sonia, and I think there is a conceptual muddle there, because illiberal politics is perfectly compatible with rampant neoliberal economic management. I mean, look at Turkey. As authoritarianism increases, the public sector is being parceled out, emptied out, subcontracted, sold at a faster pace, even in the UK, where we know what so-called private-public partnerships have done to all of us during COVID, right? They have been handed out as contracts, and we have the least efficient track and trace system, etc. So I think that these are, on the contrary, I would say that protracted economic neoliberal management increases the chances of illiberal politics, because populist policies become the adjunct of those with the ravages they create. And it is then a politics of revanchism, where what you have is not redistribution, but a license to hate. And believe me, my dears, people will vote for the freedom to hate.
Sadly.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that, Denise, it's
tragic.
And there's something else there, which is some authors are saying that what we are witnessing is a sort of revelation that capitalism just can work to its bone in a condition of fascism. That capitalism is not exactly so distinctive from fascism as a form of control of power. And I think that is not another dimension, or authoritarianism. I mean, that this notion that capitalism, because it's liberal, is always at odds with authoritarian forms of governance or tyranny. I think the world as it is showing us that this is not the case. For example, Brazil is today the lab for the combination between ultra neoliberalism and a form of authoritarianism and arbitrary power that is very close to fascism. It cannot be called fascism, but it has many traits of that.
Yeah.
So we could conclude that to some extent, the last refuge of people who are squeezing out the last drop out of this dysfunctional system is to give people an illusion that they are the people against some unspecified elite, like Trump, who did nothing but, create billionaires overnight, all the while claiming that culturally, you see, this is the thing. That's where culture creeps in, that he is a man of the people, and there is this cosmopolitan elite that somehow has these weird ideas about alternative forms of families, etc., etc. So what is being sold as a political formula has everything to do with race, gender, etc., because it is a discourse of ressentiment, basically.
Okay, thank you. Very good. Now, Chloe, would you like to see if there's a question from the audience, which we do have at least one question?
Well, there's two in there from the audience, as well as thanks for such a great conversation. One is from Nikki, who says, thank you both. And I wanted to ask Denise, at the risk of being simplistic, what would be her first steps in dismantling the free alienations that she described in the 70s, 90s, and the War on Terror? And just the disclaimer that she knows that the actual answer to this would require a whole book.
Not just one, maybe even more, a full library.
In brief, since the book is not in the offing, what I believe is that when you look at actual social movements, where they happen and where they demand progressive agendas, at the very least, where they demand democratic governance, when they want to overthrow dictators and so on, you see. What you see in these discourses is that the people who come up with these agendas have nothing to do with the NGOs. They're a completely different lot. I mean, I was very impressed, for example, I was monitoring the Arab uprisings for a webzine called Open Democracy. And what was very striking about the demonstrations on Tahrir Square is none of the foreign-funded NGOs doing human rights or women's rights, they weren't the ones there, okay? So what I'm saying is that there are social forces on the ground that are political, that are transformative. And I think that maybe we should start paying attention, engaging, and substituting our politics of aid with the politics of solidarity for a change. Okay? Instead of going around giving gender training to people, they don't need gender training. They don't need that terminology, you know? I mean, I know that I'm probably going to be criticized by many of my colleagues in the UN and so forth, but I really genuinely do not think that the propulsion for transformative change is coming from the apparatuses that have so far been set up. Saying that, one final word, I believe the state is important because it is a site of struggle. Mm-hmm. It is still the instance that legislates, passes laws, has coercive power. So I think that I can give it, if I had time, I would give you examples of how the Turkish feminist movement used the international conventions to play against their own state and how they were able to achieve substantial gains in that fashion. Very important legislative changes. That's politics, actually, you know.
Thank you.
I totally agree with Denise in that regard. I asked the question about the state, not to say that we should abandon it, because I think I agree it's a place of contestation. My question is that I would say that one urgent challenge we have is to start thinking or conceiving a politics which is not just about the state. It is also about the state, but it's not just about the state. It's a sort of politics in between, a politics that can both contest the state, but can also engage with the politics that is taking place and is evolving and is mushrooming without any direct or immediate reference to the state. I think to replace ourselves there, I think it's really very, very strategic. Because this is exactly where the anti-abortion and anti-gender forces are playing. I mean, they have, at least in Latin America, this is the spaces that, and I guess in the US to a certain extent as well, this is the domains that have been taken over, particularly by the religious organizations, but not exclusively. So I think we have a challenge there.
Thank you. Indeed, it's extremely stimulating debate. I'm sure there are lots of questions or so in people's minds. So I think this is a point where we can segue onto the plenary discussion. And we might want to hear from earlier speak. If we don't have questions from the floor yet, maybe we want to hear reflections from Alan, David, Sana, Eva rather, on what Denise and Sonia has been discussing. Any thoughts from you?
Yes.
David.
This is very fascinating. Thank you so much, the duos, for having taken us back to school and back on the streets at the same time. To Sonia, I take the twofold question of what do we do with the state for our political struggle for gender justice on the one hand, but also it comes with the echo of how do we respond to the state's cry for protection in light of this growing transnational capital, right? So are we going to be, and this is my first question, are we going to be opportunistic, like taking advantage of the state at its weakest and say, thank goodness global capital for having weakened these states, which has also been, after all, squeezing us between a rock and a hard place as far as gender justice is concerned. And so, boom, punishment, go to hell states and we go. But we shall remain with the global capital, which is a far more devouring beast, I think. What is the lesser evil, if I may put it in the Kantian way?
Okay, great. Thank you, David, for that question. So do we want to have another question or so before, and then does anybody want to put another question or respond to David? Or Alan, I see you've got your microphone unmuted, so you look ready to ask a question or make a comment, reflection.
Well, I think, no, I agree with everything that's been said around the state and needing to kind of work in and against the state. I mean, if you look at what Bannon and other ideologues on the far right talk about, they talk about Gramscian struggle, right?
Oh, yeah.
They talk about wars of position.
We have to be Gramscian again, since they are accusing us of having been Gramscian. So let's do it properly, no?
But I think what's interesting about the Trump presidency is the way it's kind of delegitimized the state. Because I mean, I think that defund the police movement, Black Lives Matter, defund the police in the summer, that was completely unimaginable even a few months before that, in my opinion. And the fact that gained traction to the extent that it did, such that, Minneapolis actually went ahead and voted to defund its police service. I think that's to do with the ways in which the Trump presidency kind of delegitimized the normalizing functions of the state. And you could see the Biden victory as a kind of renormalization of state-managed American neoliberalism, I think. To me, that's one way to read it anyway.
Sana?
I think that.
Sorry.
Sana, say something. No, it's okay. Just made
the balance between being critical of the state and legitimizing of the state, I think is quite a tricky one, because we've for so long looked to institutions and we've believed that the institutions will hold democracy to account, that every time there's, the courts are gone, the judiciary is no longer independent, and you start to think, well, there's just no way out of this. And in the process, with the constant criticism, there's no way to rescue it. And I find myself in a really contrarian sort of a position from what I was 10 years ago, believing that a lot of these things will play out. Ultimately, the institutions will hold up, but they don't. And so the state as it stands right now is happy for the institutions to fall and to get co-opted. And we are sort of falling into the trap of bringing them down as well. And so how do you navigate that is really a question which we have struggled with quite a bit over here. And I think also what you say about the work on gender among feminist organizations applies also to the work with men, because it's increasingly talking to gender relations, but not at all talking about dismantling masculinity itself. It's talking about creating positive masculinities and good men and all of that. But no one is opposed to that idea. But the relations between men themselves is something that definitely needs more work, and there isn't enough of it because it's constantly talking to gender relations, and that comes from a place of being an ally to feminism, but that might not be the only way.
May I make a sort of last-minute plea for not fetishizing the state, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But when you work in very extreme conditions where there is state collapse, and you look at how governance works there, until I was in Afghanistan, I didn't realize that it would be jolly useful to have a monopoly of the means of violence, because there was a situation where literally it was a warlord economy, and of course there was no redistribution in the sense we understand it through any social security systems or it was, if you like, a bit like the mafia, really, a bakshish economy where local potentates had their retinue and took care of their own community. Now, I think that in the modern world, probably, if we descend to that condition, which many regions of the world have descended into right now, I mean, look at Syria and so on, this in terms of any kinds of, in terms of poverty, in terms of gender, in every term is the worst case scenario. So when I talk about the state, I start from this base, and I think that we have to, and I don't think that it's an either or between transnational capital, because transnational capital is quite happy to cohabit with any kind of situation. They will have prospecting, mining rights in the north of Afghanistan. They will deal with whoever it is, if not the state. You see, so I think that's another dimension altogether. So I think that conflict situations is where things almost become caricatures of themselves in the field of gender. Indeed, as Eva had pointed out when she was talking about Azerbaijan and Armenia at the moment. Yeah.
So just thank you. Eva, you want to come in here, and then after your contribution, maybe we'll try and encourage people from the audience to also come in with questions and reflect. So Eva, over to you. What your thoughts?
Yeah, and thank you so much. It has been so interesting. I feel like I've been nodding so much that my neck hurts. the state thing, I was living in Bosnia in the 90s, and I can really say the same as Denise said, that when you have no state and when you have warlords everywhere, even if they were not called that in Bosnia for some reason, they were called the local authority, which usually was one man in a tracksuit. That actually was the local authority and could decide everything. That is never good. But what I wanted also to just point out, I think it's so important when Denise was talking to just go back in history. It's the same as David talked about looking at history, but also looking at history from this backlash / anti-gender movement to see that it just changes names. But we have to see where it comes from, and I so appreciate just being taken back to some of the places where I was as well, but also to see how we can learn from this. So we don't. I have a feeling that when it comes to gender issues, which kind of half of the people who say it doesn't know what it means anyway, we are so trendy in so many things. So that's why suddenly it becomes so important to have a lot of trainings that will take away time from activists, like Denise was saying. I think this is really valid. I once talked to someone who called himself that he took part in a training of the already trained. Because and that is always the same. It's like a weekend. We come in from the West and give our thoughts. We need to stop being so trendy. We need to dare to just continue. And I think we really, really need some spaces as soon as this bloody pandemic is over, sorry for the language, where feminists of all kinds have a space to just strategize. Because it was too long ago where we actually came together to come up, not with counteracting, but with acting. I think that's it. Sorry, that was rambling.
No, those are nice thoughts. We had a question now from the audience, Magali Marquez. So, Chloe, do you want to read out the question, or can we invite people to switch on the camera and microphone to ask it themselves?
I think the latter, yeah, let's...
Magali, would you be able to switch your camera and microphone on? Is that a possibility? I should know this.
Here's the voice. The camera will come in a minute. The question is more, since this great debate, by the way, as I put it in writing, since a lot of the struggle and the conflicts that we're experiencing has to do with narratives, creating reality through creation of narratives. I'm wondering, what role the media can play. It has played, as we know, but what of a positive role could a different media that would work more in solidarity with civil society and its struggles could play in facing state and other more dominant forces? What we see is more of a constant back and forth, like a ping pong type of dialogue between media, mainstream media and official governments. But if we were to partner, we as civil society, with some sorts of powerful media, as others have done, as evangelicals have done, especially in Latin America, and in the United States, but in many other places. But we never considered that partnership more seriously. Could we have more of a chance of influencing the narrative and the culture and the politics?
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Magali. So I'll invite panelists or speakers to reflect on that. Any thoughts about the feasibility of...
I think this is critical because the media is important for gender, battles or sexuality battles and for politics at large. I just want to say that this is a domain that is in total flux. Huh? The question of the complex correlation between mainstream media and the digital universe of circulation of information, or even the question of the social networks platform. So this is a universe that cannot be, in my view, more addressed as you used to do, Magali, in the 90s in Brazil. Oh, let's influence the mainstream media. It does not work like that. Huh? Pick up the case of Brazil, where a person like Olavo de Carvalho, who is the guru, the guru of Bolsonaro, he became an idol, not through the mainstream media, though the mainstream media has given him some place back in the 90s, but he became a blast just doing YouTube. He became an YouTuber. Huh? So, I mean, that universe, we have to think of the question, not just in terms of the mainstream media. We have to think of the whole universe of information and communication technology. What I want to say, and Magali, in Latin America, the evangelicals have not influenced the media. They have bought media companies, which is entirely different. They are the owners of their own media companies. They are propelling their discourses through their own mediatic vehicles. So this is something else. I don't see us buying any media company at this point. So this is not feasible. So I think that complexity needs to be addressed. In Brazil, we have made huge strides in the relation with the mainstream media, particularly after Bolsonaro. Now the media is our best friend ever. You know, I spend at least 8 hours a week just dealing with the mainstream media. Okay, this is good. Yes, it's wonderful, but it does not resolve the whole problem. Huh? Because the other dimensions of communication is very critical. And furthermore, one key piece of these forces is that they are very savvy in communication. They are extremely savvy in communication technologies. They are the best. And we are running after them. This is for sure. And this is something that we need to improve on our side. At least that's my view.
Thank you. Anyone else on the media and how, well, whether it's mainstream or the changing future of information technology, not technology as much as the political economy of information, perhaps. Does anybody have any more thoughts on that?
I do think that there are ways to capture media attention, and a lot of street protests, at least in India, have been able to do that. Now, how they get constructed is a different story, and who drives that narrative is, of course, very, very complex. But I think there is much more happening beyond TV news, and there is slowly a discrediting of TV news also, although it's all pervasive. But I think we have to learn to do media beyond campaigns. And I think the way that we do campaigns, and gender campaigns especially, are very, very, they're quite removed from current events and what's happening in the world. And every campaign or any kind of media intervention does not necessarily need to be about gender per se. It has to be about whatever we have to recognize that this struggle is beyond gender. And also, I think feminists have to learn to capitalize on what's happening around the world and try and create opportunities to capture media attention in ways that are possible to do. I mean, I don't think buying media houses is ever something that civil society can do.
Besides, yeah, good point.
Besides, if I may add that in many countries, it's such a big corporate enterprise, media. A lot of people just use social media because they know they're not getting it right. And social media is a very double-edged sword. I don't know if Alan is still with us, but I delved into something called the manosphere in the United States, where some of his buddies on the right live. And it is absolutely frightening. So I think the proliferation of media has, if anything, to my mind, accelerated the level of threat that people with feminist agendas are under, that people receive death threats. I don't know. I mean, I haven't spent much time there, and I don't want to, but I can assure you it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah.
And not even because of the right wing, it's also because the way social media, the structural characteristic of social media, where you are regulated by the algorithm. It's not free flow of information. I mean, you get what you get because the algorithm knows what you know, what you want, and so you're in a bubble all the time. So this is very tricky.
Thank you. So I think, David, you want to come in? Now, just conscious of time, we've got 3 minutes left. So one more reflection.
Okay, well, half a minute. I think I very much appreciate the point Sana has made, and we are just separated by the Indian Ocean, I think, and we occupy the same platform. There is a tendency to think that, Africa has perhaps 1% of the world internet consumption. And so one can easily say there is very little coming out from Africa. And Africa is very much a prototypical dark continent as far as internet is concerned, proportionally darker. But that does mean that there's very little happening. CNN, BBC will easily say we have very little coverage and very little gender justice struggles. And because the understanding of media and the campaign has been collapsed, and we miss really what the media is doing. The silencing of media is something which perhaps if the mainstream could shut up, have the big mouth shut and then ears open, we will have salvaged the mainstream media. But I think there is something else which is taking place, and it's not just this in the headlines. Nigeria, SARS police, South African anti-xenophobic attack, or Congo's rape, and Ugandan's anti-homosexuality bill. Those are headlines, but beyond the headlines, we have very serious stuff and very serious struggle, progressive struggle for gender justice. That's even bypassing social media, I'm afraid.
Yes. So maybe reflecting on that and echoing back to something, I don't know if it was Sonia or Denise who said we should maybe engage more, think about the struggles that are going on, and think about how we engage with those in a more intelligent way for gender justice. And we are running out of time now in the last minute. I'm conscious that we haven't spoken very much yet about what all of this might mean for work with men and boys for gender justice, which of course is the theme of the MenEngage Ubuntu Symposium, and we will not have time to resolve in the last minute, but there are other sessions on that topic. And indeed, in this series of backlash sessions, we will be progressively moving towards more practical questions and debates about what to do in different policy areas, but also in relation to things like the co-option of neoliberal co-option of policy in gender work, but also more workshop-y style session on what movements can do together. But that's just a teaser to encourage people to look out for those future sessions. And I would just like to finish by thanking all of you, Sana, Eva, David, Alan, Denise, and Sonia, as well as thanking Chloe, Sinead, and others behind the scenes, including Magali and many, many people who know who you are. And I won't be able to remember everyone. But thank you all. We are out of time. This will be recorded. It should become available on the MenEngage Symposium website. And we will be in touch for any future editing of the discussion that we might possibly share on the Countering Backlash website, for example, or through partners in the regions. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Jurka.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.